Helena
Ma'am, it was an honor.
arrives in Montana.
Indeed, sir.
The Montana Territory in the autumn of 1879 was a place that could strip a person down to their bones, dry wind gnawing at the skin skies so wide they seemed to push you into the dirt, and the thin metallic taste of frost still clinging to the grass. When the stagecoach finally jolted to a stop in Ash Hollow, Helena Bradberry felt the shift in the air before her boots even touched the ground. She stepped down carefully, one gloved hand gripping the rail with the kind of
Ma'am, it
quiet
was an honor.
desperation she would
Indeed,
never
sir.
allow anyone to see. The wood was worn smooth by years of other travelers' hands, and she wondered briefly what stories had passed through this very spot, how many had arrived hopeful, and how many had left broken. Her boots hit the dust with a finality that rang in her chest, each step a sentence being carried out. She had not spoken a word during the long, rattling ride from the nearest rail spur, not when the driver cheerfully pointed out the new brick bank going up on the edge of town, not when he tried to fill the silence with gossip about cattle prices and an early snow. That bank, he said with a proud nod, would be her husband's, or rather the man who had paid her father enough to turn a young woman's future into a bargaining chip. Helena was 21, raised among fine parlors and the discipline of Boston society, trained in the art of polite smiles and measured words. On paper, she was everything a man like Charles Whitlow could want, educated, genteel, well-suited to the quiet respectability of a banker's wife. In reality, she was standing on a dirt street in a place that smelled of horses and wood smoke, feeling the weight of a choice she had never been asked to make. Meeting Charles Whitlow. Charles Whitlow stood beside a polished black carriage as if he had been carved to fit the part. His suit was cut from fine cloth, his boots shined, his burgundy cravat knotted with precision. Even from across the street, Helena could see that every inch of him was deliberate, from the sweep of his hair to the glint of the gold watch chain at his vest. His smile was equally deliberate, warm enough to be called pleasant, but edged with something that felt like possession. "Miss Bradberry," he said, stepping forward to take her hand. His lips brushed her knuckles with the lightness of custom, yet his eyes flicked immediately toward her luggage, assessing its size, its weight, perhaps its worth. "You are more beautiful than I was told." Helena forced the smallest smile, the kind one wears when trapped in a conversation they cannot escape. "Mr. Whitlow," she began, but he interrupted smoothly. "Charles," he corrected, as though her compliance was already a foregone conclusion. Without missing a beat, he turned to the driver. "She has 3 trunks. See to them." As the men busied themselves, Helena allowed her gaze to wander. Ash Hollow was hardly more than a handful of streets stitched together, its saloons paint curling away in strips, its boardwalk sagging in places where the nails had worked loose. A pair of children raced after a rangy dog past the livery stable, their laughter bright against the quiet of the morning. It was nothing like Boston's polished brick and gas lamps, but for a moment something inside her chest loosened, as though the space between these weathered buildings might hold a kind of freedom she had never known. That feeling lasted only until she saw him. First glance with Franklin Hale. He emerged from behind the telegraph office, tall and dust-covered, leading a chestnut mare that shifted its weight with the restless impatience of a long trail ride. His shirt was open at the throat, the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and the rifle slung casually across his back looked more like an extension of his arm than a burden. His eyes, sharp assessing steady, caught hers in a glance that did not slide away in politeness, but held as if measuring something unspoken between them. He was not polished. He was not waiting for her, and yet Helena felt the world narrow until the only thing she could see was the dust curling in the air between them. Charles followed her gaze, and without looking at her said tightly, "That one's trouble. Franklin Hale drives cattle south, drinks too much, and thinks far too highly of himself." The warning was meant to close a door before it was opened, but Franklin was already walking past his stride unhurried. As he drew even with her, he dipped his head slightly, not enough to be called a greeting, but enough to leave its mark. Helena's heart gave a traitorous, quickened beat, and for reasons she couldn't yet name, she found herself wishing he would turn back. He didn't. Within moments, he was swallowed by the sunlit haze at the far end of the street, leaving her to follow Charles toward the imposing 3-story house that would be hers, though it felt nothing like home. The cold walls of the Whitlow home. The Whitlow residence stood like a polished sentinel at the end of the street, its 3 stories bristling with windows that reflected nothing of the warmth one might expect from a home. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with beeswax polish, as if even the smell of living had been scrubbed away. The floors gleamed, the rugs were tightly woven, the furniture heavy and expensive, but it was the kind of luxury that pressed in rather than welcomed. Helena's footsteps echoed softly as she followed Charles through the entry hall. He spoke in the measured tone of a man accustomed to being listened to, pointing out the parlor where she would receive guests, of standing the dining room where they would entertain business acquaintances, the upstairs study where she was not to disturb his work. He outlined the wedding plans with the efficiency of someone finalizing a business merger's guest lists, floral arrangements, the necessity of her learning local etiquette so she would not embarrass them at the civic functions. Helena nodded at the right moments, but her gaze wandered over the walls, noting the absence of photographs or any sign of life beyond the ornamental. It was as though the house itself was a suit of armor, handsome, impenetrable, and entirely without softness. When they reached the bedroom that had been prepared for her, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at the 4 walls, listening to the muffled tick of a clock in the hallway. She could still hear Charles's voice downstairs, discussing something with the maid, the words indistinct, but carrying that same clipped authority. Helena sat on the edge of the bed and realized that the house felt less like a place to live, and more like a cage built with money instead of iron. The urge to open a window and let in air, real air, not the still perfumed kind that lingered here, was almost overwhelming. Her first escape to the river was. The next morning, Helena woke to pale light spilling across the ceiling. She told the maid she wanted to see the church, her voice calm, her gloves already buttoned. The maid, young and plainly nervous in her presence, offered to arrange for the carriage, but Helena declined. "I'd like to walk," she said. Once outside, the brisk air bit at her cheeks, but it was a welcome bite, sharp and honest. She walked past the church without slowing, past the last cluster of houses, until the dirt road narrowed and dipped toward the river. The land opened wide here, cottonwoods bowing gently over the bank water, sliding past with a low, constant murmur. She stood near the edge, the hem of her dress gathering damp soil, and for the first time in weeks, she felt her breath come without effort. That was when she heard the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. She turned to find Franklin Hale atop a tall bay reins, loose in one hand, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. "You always wander off dressed like that," he said, voice easy but edged with curiosity, "or just when you're trying to disappear." Helena startled, then smoothed her skirts with a reflex born of upbringing. "I needed air," she replied. He dismounted in one fluid motion, the leather of his boots creaking softly. The silence that stretched between them was not awkward, it was weighted, but in a way that felt strangely safe. Helena tilted her head. "I remember seeing you yesterday." He gave a slow nod. "I remember seeing you too." They stood there, two strangers, who felt anything but looking out over the cottonwoods while the river carried its secrets downstream. The pattern of meetings by the water. After that day, Helena found reasons, thin, transparent reasons, to return to the river. She told herself it was the air, the open space, the quiet, but she knew it was also the possibility of finding him there. Franklin seemed to know it too. He never came from the same direction twice, but somehow he always appeared. Sometimes he would tie his horse to a low branch and sit on the bank rolling a twig between his fingers while they talked. Other times they walked along the water, the rhythm of their steps falling into an unspoken accord. He told her about Kansas, about losing his father when he was barely more than a boy, about raising his two half-brothers before he'd even grown into his own boots. His voice was steady when he said he hated banks, how one had taken his mother's land during a drought, leaving them with nothing but the clothes they wore. Helena in turn spoke of Boston, the weight of winter fog on the harbor, the music her mother played in the parlor on Sunday afternoons, the smell of her father's books. She never told him she was promised to another man, and he never asked why her eyes sometimes held a sadness that did not match her age. Once she brought him bread from the Whitlow kitchen, offering it like an apology for reasons she couldn't name. He laughed a warm, surprised sound and said, "You don't owe me anything." She answered quietly, "I know, but I want to." He didn't touch her, not then, but his eyes lingered as if his hands already had. Helena speaks the truth. The wind had turned sharp that evening, carrying with it the scent of rain and something electric that made the hair at the back of Helena's neck lift. She met Franklin at the riverbank, the cottonwoods shivering overhead, their leaves whispering like they knew what was coming. She stood with her hands clasped her skirts, brushing the damp grass, and before she could think better of it, the words slipped out quiet, but heavy with months of silence. "I don't want to marry him." Franklin, who had been staring out over the slow curl of the water, stilled completely. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't even look at her. Then he turned his face unreadable in the fading light. "You think I don't know that?" her breath caught. You've known." He stepped closer, not in accusation, but in certainty. "I've watched you walk into town like your shoes weigh more than your body, and I've stood out here thinking if I was a better man, I'd tell you to go home." She swallowed hard, her heart thudding like a drum in her ribs. "But you're not telling me that," she whispered. "No," he said, his voice low and firm. His hand lifted then slow, as sunrise fingers brushing her cheek like he was afraid to break her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't stolen. It was everything she hadn't known how to want until now. The first drop of rain landed between them, cold against her skin, followed by another and another, until the sky itself seemed to be leaning down to listen. Franklin's thumb lingered at her jaw. "You come with me," he said. "Tonight." The decision to flee. The storm moved in with purpose, a low rumble rolling across the hills as they made their way back to town by separate paths. Helena's hands shook as she stuffed a small satchel with what little she dared take 2 changes of clothes, a hairbrush, the worn book of poems her mother had once read aloud to her. She left the trunks behind. They felt like anchors to a life she no longer wanted. By the time she slipped out the back door, the streets were slick with rain, the lamps casting thin halos in the mist. Franklin was waiting where the road dipped toward the freight yard, his bay mare and a second smaller horse saddled and ready. He didn't speak as she swung into the saddle, her skirts tucked against the wet leather, her hands gripping his waist once they set off. The moon broke through the clouds in fractured silver, lighting their path westward. The rhythm of the horse's hooves drowned out her doubts. By the time they reached the cabin, a single-room structure of pine and stone set against the sheltering arms of the hills, the fire inside was already lit. Franklin had left it that way, a silent promise that she'd be welcome if she chose this path. She stepped inside, shaking the rain from her hair, the scent of wood smoke and warm wool settling around her like a blanket. He closed the door against the wind, and in that quiet space between thunder and breath, she realized there was no going back. That night he kissed her as though they had all the time in the world, and she kissed him back like they didn't. The letter from the storm morning came soft and gray, the storm's edge lingering in the smell of wet earth and pine. Helena woke to the steady thump of Franklin's heartbeat under her ear, the quilt pulled high against the chill. "I took you," he said quietly, as though confessing a crime, "and I'd do it again." She smiled, the words warming her more than the fire. Before she could answer, a knock sounded sharp, deliberate against the door. Franklin rose in one fluid motion, already reaching for the rifle propped near the frame. Helena stayed close to the hearth, the wool blanket clutched tight. When he swung open the door, a man stood on the porch, coat soaked through a rawhide satchel slung across his chest. His face bore the hard map of the frontier, creased from sun, wind, and miles. "You Franklin Hale?" the man asked, voice steady but wind-worn. "I am," Franklin replied. "I've got a letter for you. Came through from Fort Benton. Rode 2 days to find you." Franklin lowered the rifle slightly. "You always deliver mail on horseback in a storm?" The man gave a shrug. "Only when it's from someone dying." No further explanation, just a handoff of the envelope and the creak of leather as he turned back into the trees. Franklin stood in the doorway a long moment, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. When he opened the letter, Helena stayed silent, watching him read. Once fold it and slide it into the chest by the door. "My mother's cousin," he said, finally. "She passed. Left me a strip of land near Big Timber. Said she wanted it to go to someone who'd use it." His gaze was somewhere far away past the walls, past the hills. "Will you go?" she asked softly. He shook his head once. "I don't know yet." Heading west, toward the inheritance. The morning after the letter, the air in the cabin felt different, thick with the weight of possibility and the quiet unease of change. Franklin moved about with a focus she hadn't seen in him before, checking the cinches on both saddles, wrapping the loaf of bread left from last night in a cloth and filling the canteens from the creek. Helena folded the quilt, her fingers lingering on the worn stitching, and tucked it into one of the saddle rolls, without being asked. The land at Big Timber was now a shape in her mind, a place she had never seen, but could already imagine a stretch of earth that could be theirs if they dared to take it. Franklin didn't speak of the risks, but Helena felt them all the same. To ride west meant leaving behind the relative anonymity of the cabin and stepping into open country where eyes might follow and words might travel. Charles Whitlow's reach was long, and though she had no proof he would come after her, she knew his pride would not take the insult quietly. Still, the thought of living under his roof again, of walking those heavy carpeted halls, with her breath caught in her chest, was worse than the dangers of the road. They left under a low, rolling sky, the kind that promised either rain or a long, sullen wind. The trail they took wasn't marked on any map. Franklin had learned it years ago, following old hunting paths and the faint scars left by trappers' sledges. He kept them away from the main road, skirting the edges of timber where the trees closed in tight and muffled the sound of their passage. Helena adjusted to the rhythm of travel quickly, her body swaying with the horse's stride, her eyes scanning the land the way she had seen him do. At midday, they stopped near a stand of willows by a shallow bend in the river. Franklin showed her how to refill the canteens without muddying the water, then broke bread and handed her a piece with a slice of smoked meat. They ate in silence, the only sound the slow gulp of the river as it moved past. By nightfall, the horizon had shifted. The hills seemed to roll longer, the trees sparser. They found shelter in the remains of an old trapper's lean-to, its roof patched with pine boughs, the floor scattered with the ghosts of past fires. Franklin worked methodically, sweeping out the debris, laying kindling, and coaxing a flame from the spark of flint. Helena spread their blankets, adding the quilt for warmth, then went to the stream for water. She watched her reflection ripple and vanish under the current, and thought about how quickly a life could change, how she had been in Boston less than a year ago, bound by rules she'd never questioned, and now she was here, in a place no one in her old world would even recognize. When she returned, Franklin was sitting cross-legged by the fire, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He glanced up as she set the water down. "You ever think about what comes after this?" he asked. Helena lowered herself beside him. "I used to think about Boston," she said. "Then I stopped. Now I think about what I haven't seen yet." He nodded, a small, almost private smile touching his mouth. "I figure if the land's as good as she said, we can make something that'll last. Something worth staying for." The fire cracked softly between them, and Helena thought that if the road ahead led anywhere near that kind of life, she'd ride it without looking back, avoiding the roads and staying ahead of shadows. They rose before dawn, the air brittle with cold. Franklin saddled the horses, while Helena packed their few belongings, tying everything tight with strips of cloth to keep it from shifting. The first stretch of the day took them along a ridge where the wind pressed hard from the west, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere unseen. Helena kept her gaze low, the brim of her hat shading her eyes, and trusted Franklin's lead without question. By mid-morning, they spotted movement on the plain below, a pair of riders leading a wagon. The figures were distant, their features impossible to make out, but something in Franklin's shoulders tightened. Without a word, he turned his horse into the tree line, the branches brushing their legs as they wound deeper into the shadows. They rode hard for several minutes before slowing, the sounds of the open plain replaced by the close hush of pine needles under hoof. When they finally stopped, Franklin listened for a long moment, scanning the trees. "Do you know them?" Helena asked, her voice low. He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Anyone who sees us might talk, and I'd rather not give anyone something to talk about." That night, They camped near a narrow stream, the water so clear she could see each pebble on the bottom. Franklin went out with his rifle and returned with a rabbit already strung. Helena cleaned it without hesitation, her hands steady in the firelight. He watched her across the flames, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. "You ain't soft," he said. She met his gaze. "No one ever gave me the chance to be. They ate under a sky so full of stars, it seemed impossible it was the same one that hung over Boston." Franklin reached across the fire and took her hand, the gesture both steadying and unspoken promise. "I'll build you a house," he said. "By spring, we'll have it up. You'll have a garden and a porch and a place for your books." Helena smiled faintly. "And if someone comes for me," he didn't let go of her hand, "they'll have to get through me first." She believed him not because of the way he said it, but because of the way he'd lived every moment since she had met him without flinching. Reaching the new land. When they reached the land, it was more than Franklin remembered. The grass rolled in long golden waves, the creek cutting a silver line through the valley, and the cottonwoods leaning in like old friends ready to share their shade. Helena dismounted slowly, letting her boots sink into the soft ground. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the way the sunlight moved across the clearing. "You're sure it's ours?" she asked. Franklin nodded once. "It is now." They set up camp by the creek that first night, Franklin building a frame for shelter, while Helena gathered stones for a hearth. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth and the resin of pine. Her hands grew raw stacking stones, but she didn't mind. There was something satisfying about the work, about knowing that each stone she placed would hold back the wind when the snow came. In the evenings they sat by the fire, Franklin telling her stories from the trail of storms that turned the sky green, of a man who once roped a cougar by mistake of a winter so cold the river froze solid to the Missouri. She laughed more easily now, the sound surprising her at times. One morning, as she knelt by the creek washing clothes, Helena asked, "When you said you'd make me a home, did you mean it just for now?" Franklin stepped into the water beside her, boots off trousers rolled to the knee. "I meant it for always." She stood, water dripping from her skirts, and pressed her forehead to his chest. "Then I want to marry you, not with lace and paper, but with work, with staying." He wrapped his arms around her. "Then you already have." The creek kept on flowing, the cottonwoods whispered overhead, and the land around them seemed to draw a quiet breath, as if it too had been waiting for someone to claim it. A proposal without a ring. The days on the new land found their rhythm, mornings that began with the thin gold of sunrise cutting through the cottonwoods, evenings that closed with the low song of the creek. Franklin had started sketching the outline of a cabin with a stick in the dirt, explaining each line like he could already see the walls rising. Helena worked beside him without question, hauling water, stacking the smaller stones he used to anchor the corners. They spoke more with glances than words, and yet the silence felt full, not empty. One afternoon the sky was a deep, hard blue, the air sharp with the scent of pine sap. Helena was on her knees, sleeves rolled, hands buried in the earth as she planted the first rows of carrots and beans. Franklin stood a few yards away, driving a stake into the ground with slow, deliberate blows. She watched him between handfuls of seeds, the flex of his shoulders under his shirt, the way he paused every so often to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. When he finished, he walked over boots, leaving shallow prints in the soft dirt. "I saw a preacher in town," he said casually, unlacing his gloves. Comes up from Virginia City once a month, does baptisms, funerals, and the rest. Helena leaned back on her heels. You asking me something? He shrugged, but his eyes didn't waver. I'm saying, if you want it done proper, we could ride in next time he's here. She rose, brushing the dirt from her hands. You built this with me. You sleep beside me. You feed me before yourself. I don't need a preacher to make that real. His hands found hers rough and warm. Still, maybe one day we do it for the folks who come after us. Helena thought about it for a moment, the late light catching in her hair. All right. One day. They stood like that until the wind shifted, carrying the promise of another cool night. And though no vows were spoken, she knew they had just bound themselves to something deeper than paper could hold. The woman named Litty Carter. The first sign of her arrival was the horse, a deep bay with a winter coat still clinging to its flanks, standing loose at the creek reins, dragging in the shallows. Helena's breath caught. She scanned the tree line until a voice low and even called from the shadows. Didn't mean to startle you. The woman who stepped forward was wrapped in a worn wool cloak, a dark braid trailing down the back of her faded dress. Her face was sun-browned, lined at the edges, but her eyes were clear and sharp, holding the kind of knowledge only the land could teach. You Helena Bradberry? The woman asked. Helena stiffened. I am. The woman nodded. Name's Litty Carter. My brother runs cattle west of here. I pass through once a season. Helena glanced toward the cabin where Franklin was splitting wood. You'll need something. Just wanted to see who'd taken up the old Mercer land. Last I heard it was sitting empty. Helena hesitated. My husband inherited it. Litty's brow lifted. Franklin Hale. Helena nodded. The woman's expression softened. Good man. Rode with my nephew during the blizzard of '77. Saved his life dragging him out of a drift. Never said a word about it after. Helena felt something settle in her chest. He wouldn't. Litty stepped closer, her gaze drifting to the half-built barn. If you ever need help with curing or trapping, send word. I don't live far as the crow flies. Helena inclined her head. I appreciate that. Litty turned to go, then paused. Lot of people talk in town, you know, about how you left. Helena's shoulders tightened, but the woman's voice softened. They can't imagine a woman choosing the hard life. But I did long before you. Never regretted it. With that, she swung onto her horse and rode away, leaving Helena standing at the creek, the sound of running water loud in her ears. She returned to the cabin without mentioning the visit, simply picking up the kindling and laying it by the hearth as though nothing had changed, though inside something had. Quiet days and careful plans. The next weeks folded into one another like pages in a book you don't want to finish. The barn frame rose, its beams notched and set by Franklin's steady hands. Helena carried tools, held ladders, fetched water, each task a piece of a larger vision she could see taking shape. In the evenings they would sit on the porch frame, watching the sun melt into the hills. The first frog call would rise from the creek, and Franklin would reach for her hand, without looking away from the horizon. You ever miss the city? He asked one night. She thought about it for a long time before answering. I think it missed me more than I ever missed it. He smiled faintly at that, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. When we get the barn finished, I'll go north and bring down my brothers. They're working a hay spread near Judith Gap, but they said they'd come once we were ready. Helena tilted her head. You think they'll like me? Franklin chuckled. You planted beans in the right month and haven't thrown a skillet at me, yet they'll think you're a saint. They made plans in the same way they built everything else practical, step by step. Fence first, she said. Then bring them. Fence first, he agreed. And so they worked toward it, 28 posts, each notched by hand, the line running from the west tree line to the bend in the creek. Franklin's palms blistered beneath the leather of his gloves. Helena's forearms bore the sun's mark from holding beams steady while he hammered them in. But there was pride in the ache in the way their work left its trace on their body. By early June, the beans had sprouted, and she checked them each morning, murmuring to the leaves as though coaxing them higher. Inside the cabin, the bare walls now held a rocking chair Franklin had traded for at the rail spur, a shelf he'd carved for her books and curtains she'd sewn from muslin, softening the light over the table. When the wind was right, the air smelled of pine shavings and fresh bread. And in the quiet between chores, Helena sometimes found herself thinking, we aren't running anymore. We're building. Franklin's private clearing. The day Franklin decided to show Helena the clearing dawned bright but cool, the kind of crisp morning that made the breath hang like smoke in the air. He'd been quieter than usual over breakfast, his eyes drifting toward the tree line beyond the fence as though measuring the hours of light they'd have before dusk. Helena had learned not to press him when he was like this. Franklin's silences were not evasions but doorways. He'd open them when the time was right. By mid-afternoon, with the sun tilting westward, he leaned against the fence post, watching her work a strip of cloth into a neat bandage for his wrist. "There's something I want to show you," he said, nodding toward the north. "If you're not too tired." She tied the knot on the cloth, smoothed it with her palm. "I'm never too tired for you." They followed the creek northward, where the water narrowed and the banks drew closer together, trees bending in to form a natural arch overhead. The air was cooler here, full of the scent of damp earth and the sweet tang of wild mint crushed under their boots. A fallen log served as a bridge across the water, its bark stripped smooth by years of weather. Franklin stepped onto it first, then reached back to steady her hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused, the kind of hold that made you feel you wouldn't fall, even if you stumbled. On the other side, the land opened suddenly into a round clearing, the grass thick and green, a rise of stone set near its center, like an altar placed there by time itself. Wild columbine bloomed at the edges, their pale petals nodding in the breeze. Franklin stopped just inside the clearing, letting her take it in. "I found this place when I was 16, he said. "Used to come here when I needed to think." His voice softened as though admitting something private. "Figured if we ever had a child, this is where I'd teach them to shoot." Helena stepped toward the stone, her fingers trailing along its mossy edge. She could picture it a boy or girl with Franklin's steady hands and her mother's stubborn chin, the air ringing with laughter and the sharp crack of target practice. "You think about that more since I came?" she asked. He shifted one boot, scuffing the grass. "Doesn't matter if it's a boy or a girl. I just want them to have your eyes." The words caught her off guard, warm and steadying all at once. She sat on the grass skirts, pooling around her, and patted the space beside her. "Then come sit. Tell me what else you want." He lowered himself until their knees brushed. A smokehouse, 2 pigs, maybe a mare good enough to breed, and a winter where we don't have to burn green wood. She smiled faintly. "I want a letter from my mother, just once. To know she's all right." and that she doesn't hate me for leaving. He didn't try to comfort her with platitudes, just said, "We can send word through Litty if you want." Quiet. She looked away toward the tree line. Not yet. Maybe after the first frost. They sat until the sun dropped behind the ridge, and on the walk back she realized this was the first place in Montana that felt entirely theirs, marking a place for what's to come. That night, the sky turned restless. Far-off thunder grumbled over the hills, the sound rolling in low waves. Franklin stood at the door with his rifle laid across the frame, watching the horizon, as the wind carried the smell of rain. Helena set a bowl of stew on the table, lighting the second lamp before joining him. "Storm will pass north," he said without turning. She leaned into him, feeling the steady warmth of his side. "Let it. We're not going anywhere." In the days that followed, Helena began a quiet project. From a length of pine Franklin had cut for kindling, she carved 2 names into the grain, hers beside his, and left a third space blank. She didn't tell him why. When she nailed it to the wall above the hearth, he came to stand beside her, running his fingers over the letters without a word. His touch lingered on the empty space, but he didn't ask. A week later, Franklin's youngest brother arrived on horseback, dust-covered, and lean a sack of dried meat slung over one shoulder. "Thought I'd find you holed up in some canyon." The boy grinned, dismounting. Didn't expect a porch and a woman. Franklin clasped his arm in greeting. "You expecting to stay if you'll have me?" Helena brought out water and bread, her gaze steady. "We've room if you're willing to work." The boy tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am." That evening after chores, the 3 of them sat on the half-built porch, watching the sun sink in molten gold behind the hills. Helena rested her cheek against Franklin's shoulder, the warmth of his shirt carrying the scent of sweat and wood smoke. "You think we'll hold all this?" she asked. His arm tightened around her. "We already are." It wasn't a boast, it was a simple truth, and somehow that made it stronger. Nate joins the work. By late July, the barn stood complete, its cedar-shingled roof still smelling of fresh split wood. Nate, quiet, sharp-eyed, and far more capable than his years suggested, had taken naturally to the work. He was good with a team, quick with numbers, and just as steady under strain as Franklin. Helena noticed the way he lingered at the pasture fence in the evenings, his gaze fixed on the hills as though waiting for something unspoken to return. She didn't ask. The land had its way of holding on to people's silences. Franklin had traded with a passing herd driver for 2 milk cows and a rust-colored bull calf. They grazed in the lush grass near the creek, their hides shining in the summer light. Helena rose before the sun each morning to milk the cows, her skirts damp at the hem by the time breakfast was on the table. Her hands had grown sure, her movements unhurried. The life here had settled into her bones. One morning, as she poured cream into the butter churn, her hand stilled. A faint, almost imperceptible change in her body told her what her mind had not yet dared to name. Franklin, washing at the basin, looked over. Something wrong. She met his eyes, startled at her own stillness. "No. Just I think I know what that empty space on our wall is for." The words hung between them until his eyes widened in quiet understanding. "You're sure?" She nodded, her voice low. Not far along, but enough to feel it. He crossed the room in 2 strides, wrapping his arms around her, his face pressed into her hair. When he pulled back, there was a steadiness in his gaze she hadn't seen since spring. "I'll build a cradle," he said. No fanfare, no exclamation, just the same certainty with which he built everything that mattered. That night, as the fire snapped in the hearth, and Nate carved a small wooden bird from a scrap of cedar, Helena felt the first real warmth of knowing their family had already begun to grow. Not in theory, but in the quiet truth of her body. The homestead gathers. Strength August ripened the valley the way a careful hand ripens fruit slowly, evenly without spectacle. Each morning began with the same small vows, Helena's hands on the milk pails before the sun pushed a pale coin of light over the ridge. Franklin walking the fence line with a length of rawhide tucked in his belt to fix whatever the night had worried loose. Nate already at the barn, mouth sleeves, rolled eyes set on the day's ledger he kept in his head. The creek ran low and clear, a silver thread stitched through grass that had gone from spring's bright green to the honeyed hue of late summer. The 2 milk cows took to the place as if they'd been born for it, bellies round on sweet forage hides, shining when dusk spilled gold across their backs. The bull calf learned to kick up his heels at the exact hour when shadows lengthened. Nate swore he was a clock with hooves. Inside the cabin, small changes spoke louder than declarations. A peg appeared by the door for Franklin's hat. A square of braided rug lay beside the hearth where Helena liked to kneel when she banked the night coals. On a narrow shelf, the book of poems from Boston took its place between a tin of lamp oil and a folded length of muslin as ordinary here as a spoon. It was in this everyday abundance that Helena felt the child inside her like a tide turning. The first knowledge had been a stillness, then a hum, something that changed the weight of her step and steadied her hands in a new way. She caught it in her reflection once, a softer line around the mouth, a quiet occupying the eyes. She told Franklin, and he didn't celebrate with shouts or plans that flew too far ahead. He answered like the land would answer, with a cradle drawn out on a plank, measurements, careful wood chosen by sound. At night, when the coyotes sang thin and high from the far hills, he would sit at the table and rub oil into the cedar boards while Nate carved small animals from the scraps, elk fox, a lopsided cow that made Helena laugh until she had to press a hand to her ribs. In the mornings her chores shifted without anyone speaking of it. Franklin lifted the heavier buckets before she could reach for them. Nate strung another rail on the porch steps so she could take her time coming down. "I'm fine," she'd say, and they'd nod, accepting the truth of her strength while still making room for care. The field began to offer its first answers. The bean vines put out small white flags of blossom. The carrots showed their feathery tops. Helena knelt with a wooden bowl thinning seedlings with a tenderness that surprised her. In Boston, every careful act had been a performance. Here, carefulness was hunger's opposite. When the afternoon heat pressed hard, she moved to the shade and stitched by the window simple seams on tiny shifts, hems turned by lamplight so fine you could run a hair through them. She saved the smallest pieces of fabric for binding the way her mother had taught her, and marveled at how a woman's hands could make a garment sturdy enough to be handed down love and work folded into every stitch. Franklin brought news home the way other men brought coin. Passing drovers said the trail had been wet and mean that spring. A trader claimed he'd seen early snow on the distant high peaks. Someone from Ash Hollow told him the bank's brickwork had finished the corner, stone mortared with a crowd looking on. He said none of this like warning. He said it as if laying weather on a table. "The world keeps moving," Helena answered once, and he'd smiled the smallest smile, the kind that meant agreement without pride. In the evenings, they sat on the porch frame and watched night start in the cottonwoods. A whip-poor-will took up a post near the creek. The first crickets tried on their fiddles. Franklin would set his palm over Helena's belly and close his eyes, like a man mapping a country by feel. "I keep thinking about names," he admitted one night, quiet as smoke. "I don't need to know yet," she said, "but I like that you're already talking to someone." He nodded and kissed the heel of her hand, and the kiss carried a promise older than words: "We will meet whatever comes together." 20. Readying for the child. Preparation took on a holy plainness. Franklin's cradle came first, not because it was easiest, but because it anchored all the other work like a keel anchors a ship. He planed the cedar until its pale flesh gave off a scent that filled the cabin, clean, resin-sweet, a forest captured and gentled. He cut the rockers, slow-shaping them so the curve would settle like a held breath, steady but merciful. He chose pegs over nails where he could, wanting joinery that would swell and hold through winter's contraction and summer's ease. When he fitted the headboard, he paused to trace the grain, following a rivering line with his thumb as if asking the wood for safe passage. "I want it to last," he said, not looking up. Something Eliza's children could sleep in. It was the first time either of them had let a name out into the room. The syllables didn't echo. They nested quietly in the cider smell and stayed. Helena's work made a counterpoint, tiny garments laid out in a measured procession, shirts with room in the shoulders, swaddling bands, caps small as a man's palm. She stitched by day when the light was clean, and by night when the lamp drew a circle of gold on the table that felt like a fort against the world's largeness. Sometimes she hummed without knowing it, a tune she'd heard in a Boston parlor once its formal edges softened by the cottonwood's breath. She prepared other things, too, that were less visible, a bundle of herbs for easing a kettle kept bright for boiling strips torn from an old muslin petticoat and rolled smooth to bind whatever needed binding. Franklin noticed the bundle one evening and didn't ask for instructions. He only said, "Tell me where you want it when the time comes." And she realized again how love proves itself by listening. Nate became the steward of all that would be needed after. He traded an extra saddle blanket for a length of cheesecloth, bartered for beeswax, and a second basin from a peddler whose wagon wheels sang on the ruts and sharpened every edge on the place draw, knife, hoe, scythe, so there would be no insult of dullness when effort was required. The boy had a habit of shaping hope into wood. A menagerie grew on the table's edge, a fox that actually looked sly, a mule with ears so long it made Helena laugh, a fish with scales he'd scored one by one with the point of his knife until it seemed to shimmer under lamplight. One night he set down a small figure he'd whittled from a darker scrap-arm's rounded belly rounder. "Looks like you," he said, and then, mortified by his own boldness, he ducked his head. Helena touched the figure's tiny shoulder. "It looks like all of us," she answered, and left it by the cradle as if to appoint it its first guardian. The heat deepened. Cicadas braided sound through the hours. By noon, the earth gave itself over to shimmer, and Helena kept to shade, learning to honor the rise and fall of her own breath like a tide chart. In the late afternoons, weather stacked on the high peaks like folded quilts, purples and grays, lightning testing its seam allowances with distant stitches of light. When the storms missed them, the air after felt washed and new. When they hit, Franklin stood at the doorframe with the rifle laid across it, not because he expected trouble, but because standing watch was another way to pray. He had added a rail to the porch and built a little stool for her to rest on when she sat carving a shallow star into its seat that her thumb found without looking. "What if the road calls our name again?" she asked once, almost to the wind. He didn't tell her not to worry. He answered with a ledger of readiness, new thatch over the north eave, dry kindling stacked high as his waist the cradle's rockers hung smooth on their arc. His mare shod Nate's knife keen. "If the road calls, we'll choose whether to answer," he said. "This time, it doesn't choose us." And the baby turned under her hand as if to say, "I hear you. I'm coming into a house that has already put its shoulders to the world." 21. Mira Langley and the boy called Kolb. The first they knew of her was a shape against the south, light a rider cut from sun, moving without hurry and without hesitation, a smaller figure tucked behind like a shadow, learning to be its own. As the pair drew closer, details shook loose from the glare, a rifle in a scabbard, a saddle patched with careful hands, a hat brim pulled low over a woman's face that had stopped asking the world for kindness and started making its own. She swung down with the grace of someone who had been taught by necessity. The boy slid after, lean and watchful, about 10 by Helena's reckoning, his eyes the sharp blue of high air. "You, Franklin Hale?" the woman asked, voice even as a leveled beam. Franklin nodded. "I am." "Mira Langley," she said, giving him her name like a tool, not a decoration. "This here's my son Calb. Litty Carter said you might have work and a bit of shelter if a widow didn't mind laboring harder than breathing." Franklin's glance flicked toward Helena, not for permission but for compass, and in that flicker, Helena felt again the quiet grammar of their life. "We've a loft and a spare cot," Helena said, "and the south fence needs a new brace." Mira considered, then tipped her chin once. "That'll do." Calb didn't speak, but his gaze left no joint unmeasured, the barn's plumb, the corral's gate, the cradle visible through the cabin window as if to test whether this was a place that knew how to hold what it made. Franklin showed them the loft and where the wind snuck through the eaves. Helena carried up a basin and bread, and on her second trip, she found Kolb already sweeping the hay to one side with a branch broom, moving the dust like he owned it. "You're quick," she said. He shrugged, but a corner of his mouth betrayed its wish to be called good. Work began without ceremony. Mira took the south fence like it had insulted her personally. By sundown, she had a brace set the post resunk and trued, and a bloody blister she ignored with a practiced contempt of women who had walked farther than men would believe. Franklin tried to offer gloves. She shook her head. "I'll toughen," she said. "Been soft too long in the places that matter." Helena, who understood that sentence in her bones, nodded as if a hand had been shaken. The boy attached himself to Franklin the way a nail finds a magnet. He asked questions in threes. Why trim a hoof that way? Why tie a lead there and not here? Why salt the meat so heavy if you mean to eat it soon? Franklin answered each as if the asking were a gift. Nate showed Calb how to set a line and pull it tight across posts. So a fence runs true how to read the weight of a sky, not by color, but by how birds bank under it. By the end of the week, the boy's gait had shifted, less flinch, more purpose. He smiled once unguarded when the bull calf bumped his palm and accepted a scratch. Helena caught it and put it away. Another small proof that the world could be remade by attention. Mira said little about Laramie or the road behind her. Silence here was not absence. It was a fence line, respect it, and the pasture holds. At supper, she ate with the head-down focus of hunger, then leaned back and let one corner of her mouth lift when Nate's wooden mule refused to stand on its carved legs and fell over with a drama that Calb tried and failed not to laugh at. Later, when the lamps were turned low, Helena found Mira by the door running a thumb over the rail Franklin had added for Helena's sake. "You think of everything," Mira said. "We try to think of the right things," Helena answered. The woman nodded once like a tally had come out even. Days braided them together. Mira's rifle proved as practical as her hands. When a fox began testing the hen house, Mira spoke to it once with a single clean shot, and the hens slept untroubled thereafter. Calb learned to sand the cradle's edges until they were kind as a palm. He asked Helena shyly if babies minded the dark. "Not if the dark minds them back," she said, guiding his hand over the rocker's curve. One evening, as clouds stacked on the horizon, Mira took in the valley with a measuring stare. "You've got a hold on this place," she said to Franklin and Helena both. "And it's got a hold on you. That's rare as luck." Helena felt the child turn, felt the porch under her feet, felt the smell of rain. "We made the hold with work," she said, "and it keeps holding us back." When night came soft and steady with rain, the cabin didn't feel crowded. It felt complete in the way a chord feels when it finds its third. The cradle waited by the hearth cedar, breathing its slow green breath into the room. Calb dozed with a carved elk in his fist. Nate set the last peg in a corner shelf and stepped back proud in a way that didn't show in his face, but in the way his shoulders lowered. Mira tied off a line of mended harness and blew out one lamp. Franklin reached for Helena's hand in the dark and found it without searching. Outside, the rain stitched the roof to the land, and inside 4 adults and 1 boy listened to the sound and knew in the same moment that what they were building had outgrown the word two. The birth of Eliza. By the time the first frost drew lace along the edges of the creek, the cradle Franklin had built was no longer just a promise. It was an anchor in the center of the cabin, its cedar scent mingling with wood smoke and bread. Helena moved slower now, not from weakness, but from the gravity of the child she carried. Every step, every turn of her wrist was measured as if her body had learned a new rhythm. Franklin had shifted his work to keep closer to the cabin, mending tools on the porch, stacking wood in neat cords against the north wall. Nate and Calb took over the longer chores, driving the cattle toward the richer grass on the east slope, bringing in sacks of oats from the storehouse. Mira kept her voice even, but her eyes sharp, watching Helena with the quiet authority of someone who had been through this season before. "You'll want the kettle boiling before the first pains take hold," she said one evening. Matter of fact, and the blankets warm. Helena nodded her hand absently, tracing the roundness beneath her apron. In the nights leading up to the birth, the air inside seemed charged, as if the walls themselves were waiting. The fire burned longer. Bread was baked in double loaves. Franklin laid his rifle across the mantel where it could be reached without thought. The day came without ceremony, just a pale dawn and the sudden stilling of Helena's breath as she stood by the window. She gripped the sill until her knuckles whitened, then turned to Mira. "It's time." The older woman moved with a calm that steadied the whole room, stoking the fire, setting water to heat, unrolling the muslin strips Helena had prepared weeks ago. Franklin stood in the doorway, at first hands flexing uselessly at his sides. Stay close, Mira told him without looking up, but give her space to work through it. Hours passed in a slow tidal pull, Helena's world narrowing to breath-grip release. Outside, the light shifted from silver to gold shadows, stretching across the yard. Franklin paced the porch like a sentry, listening to every sound, his heart lurching at each low cry. When Mira's voice finally called him in, it was gentler than he had ever heard it. "Come meet your daughter." Helena lay propped against pillows, her hair damp at the temples, her eyes bright in a way that outshone exhaustion. In her arms, swaddled in one of the tiny shifts she had sewn, was a girl, red-faced, strong-voiced, her fists curling against the air. Franklin crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside them. He touched the baby's cheek with the back of one finger, as if testing the reality of her, then looked at Helena. "She's perfect." His voice was roughened by something deeper than relief. "Eliza Helena," said softly. "Her name is Eliza." They stayed like that, the 3 of them, as the room filled with the smell of cedar and fire and new life. Nate brought in more wood without a word. Calb hovered in the doorway until Franklin waved him in, and Mira wrapped another blanket around Helena's shoulders. Outside, the frost melted back into the earth, and a thin line of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign to anyone passing that here in this cabin by the creek, something had been made that could not be taken back. A winter, made of warmth. The snow came early that year, sweeping down from the high country in a soft white march that blanketed the hills and muted the sound of the creek. It climbed the windowsills until the world outside looked like it had been folded away. Inside, the cabin grew smaller, but not cramped full in the way a chest is full when every item has been chosen for its worth. The fire rarely burned down to embers. Someone was always tending it, even in the small hours. Helena moved through the days with Eliza, held against her chest or nestled in the cradle Franklin had set close to the hearth. The baby slept with the deep trust of the new waking to feed, to cry briefly, to gaze up at faces she seemed already to know. Calb sat cross-legged on the braided rug, letting her wrap her fingers around one of his patient as stone. Nate carved her name into a sled he had built from oak scraps, the letters deep and sure, the way he carved fence posts meant to last through storms. Mira laughed more now, a sound low and sudden, like a log splitting under an axe. In the evenings, she hummed as she mended harness or stitched patches on the blankets, the tune winding itself into the crackle of the fire. Franklin split his time between tending the cattle, now thick-coated against the cold, and checking the roof, the walls, the stores. He moved with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose home was holding against the season. One night, near the turn of the year, the snow fell so heavily that even the sound of the wind was muffled. After supper, when Eliza was asleep, Franklin pulled 2 blankets from the peg by the door and wrapped one around Helena's shoulders, the other around himself. "Come outside," he said. The air bit at her cheeks, but the sky made her forget the cold. An endless sweep of stars, so many and so bright they seemed to press closer to the earth. They stood in the snow breath, turning to clouds between them, the cabin's lamplight spilling a golden square onto the drifted yard. "You think she'll grow up soft?" Franklin asked, nodding toward the dark, where their daughter slept. Helena leaned into him, the crunch of snow under her boots the only sound for a moment. "No," she said. "She'll grow up loved. That's better." He kissed her, then slow, certain, without any of the urgency of flight or the edge of fear that had marked their first escape. It was the kind of kiss you give when you know there will be mornings to follow. When they went back inside, the warmth wrapped around them like another blanket. Eliza stirred in her cradle, sighing in her sleep. The others had settled in, Nate polishing the runners of the sled Cobb, sprawled by the fire, Mira sewing with her head bent close to the lamplight. Helena met Franklin's eyes across the room, and in that moment she felt the truth settle deep. They had not just survived, they had built something that could last, rooted into the land like the cottonwoods by the creek, strong enough to hold through whatever weather might come.